quite mind-boggling that the government has pushed through this legislation. Simply, it's a very confusing system, and as I say, it could lend to some distorted outcomes, which I think, while I don't think that's a big risk, I don't think it's something that we can completely discount.
What are the potential implications of the Electoral Amendment Bill, or now the Electoral Amendment Act, having been signed into law by President Ramaphosa? This could have wide-ranging implications for the elections next year, but also further into South Africa's future in the latter half of this decade. Joining me to unpack is Senior Analyst at the Institute of Race Relations, Marius Roodt. Marius, thanks very much for being with us for this week. Tell us a little bit about the Electoral Amendment Act, basically on paper, what it says it wants to accomplish.
So the Electoral Amendment Act is the result of about nearly 3 years of wrangling. In the middle of 2000, the Constitutional Court said that the Electoral Amendment or the Electoral Act had to be amended to allow for independents to stand for election to Parliament or any of the non-provincial legislatures. This was after somebody approached the Constitutional Court, and after the Constitutional Court found in the favour of the people who came to the court, which said, as I say, independents should now be able to stand for any of the 10 legislatures we have in South Africa. At the moment, people can stand as independents for various municipal councils, but that wasn't possible with for provincial legislatures or for Parliament. Now, the aim of this act is to allow for independents to stand, but there are some serious problems with the act. It's basically bolted on independence onto a proportional representation system. When you get your ballots next year, as it stands, you'll get a list of, as you normally do when you vote in national provincial elections, a list of political parties you could vote for, and then you'll also get a list of any independents that will be standing for, as I say, either Parliament or the non-provincial legislatures. So it's all getting quite complicated. You're also going to be getting 3 ballots as it stands according to the Act. You'll get 2 for Parliament, 1 for vote for your provincial legislature. So it's all getting pretty complicated, and there's also going to be some unforeseen consequences with this legislation, I think. Just on one more issue with that, there's also hurdles that have been put in place that are more for independents and for political parties that aren't represented in any of the non-provincial legislatures or in Parliament. As it stands, the legislation now says that if you want to stand for any of these legislatures, you have to provide the number of signatures equal to a certain quota of the number of people who voted for in the previous election. So what it comes down to is if you want to stand for Parliament, you're going to have to provide signatures of about 6,000 people, including their addresses and ID numbers and so on, and their full names, saying yes, they support this political party or independent standing for Parliament. This is a much bigger hurdle that's put in place than for political parties that are already represented in the various legislatures. So probably if you get down to it, there's probably going to be problems with equality before the law, as well as allowing people to participate freely in the political process in South Africa.
Marius, from your point of view, what would be the biggest possible unintended consequence of this new legislation in terms of, everyone goes to the voting booth in what it should be in May, I think, next year, the next general election.
Between May and August next year.
Right. So when people go to the voting booth, go and mark a cross next to whichever political party. What are some of the implications? Let's say nationally, just focus on Parliament, maybe.
So one of the biggest problems with this legislation is that votes for independents are going to be ended up being discarded, which is going to see it benefit political parties. So I'll explain how that's going to happen. So say, for argument's sake, South Africa has a parliament made which is 20 seats, and 1 million people cast their votes in each election for Parliament. That means you need about 50,000 votes to get 1 seat in Parliament. But let's say now there's a popular independent who decides to stand for Parliament, it's Tuli Madonsela or Steve Hofmeyr, whoever the case may be. But now, as I said, they're very popular. So instead of just getting 50,000, the 50,000 votes, they need to get 1 seat in Parliament. They end up getting 200,000 votes, which is enough for 4 seats. So instead of giving them just this, obviously as an independent, you can't take up more than 1 seat. So what will happen is the votes that are being cast for the independent will then be discarded, and the calculation will be done again. So, for example, if a political party won 400,000 out of the 1 million votes cast, in theory, they should get 40% of the seats in Parliament. But now, if all the votes for the independent get discarded, the 200,000 votes cast for the independent, these votes are going to be discarded, and the calculation for seats gets redone according to the legislation. So that means out of the 400,000 votes cast for the party, they will now, to calculate the political party's number of seats, the calculation is done with 800,000 votes rather than 1 million, which means that the political party will be getting 50% of the seats in Parliament rather than the 40% that they should have got, because the independent votes have now been discarded. So we might see some of these kind of distorted outcomes occurring in elections. It'll benefit bigger parties, whether that's the ANC or the DA or even the EFF, or whatever the case may be. So yeah, and that is the problem which is happening when you bolt on independence onto what is a purely party proportional representation system. It would have made much more sense if we decided to scale up the electoral system we have at the municipal level to the system we have at up to provincial and to national level. That is what's called a mixed proportional system. So you vote for a political party and you get a second ballot to vote for an individual, whether that's an independent or somebody who's representing a political party. And I mean, it's a fairly simple system. I think most people who follow South African politics, not even that close, will probably understand the system and know how it works. So yeah, just we're going to see we might see some unintended consequences. I personally don't think there's going to be a big swell of people voting for independence in the election next year. South Africa doesn't really have such a tradition of independence standing. We've in a couple of municipalities, independents sometimes do pretty well, but just not really part of South African culture. But even though that all said, you can't worry about what legislation is supposed to do. You also got to look at what legislation could do. And that is what could happen with this, with the Electoral Act as it stands. It could result in distorted outcomes. And one of the problems is that, according to the Constitution, the only requirement for our electoral system is that it has to be in general proportional. That's what it says in the Constitution. So now we can talk about what does in general proportional mean. But I think we can agree if a political party wins fewer than 50% of votes, but it's getting more than 50% of the seats in Parliament, I don't think we can say that's proportional. So, yeah, this legislation overall, it's quite a poor piece of legislation. I'm still not sure why it's being pushed through so quickly, and yeah, it's a bit of a problem. The only good thing I think that's coming out of the legislation is that now by law, the Minister of Home Affairs has to put in place a committee that's going to look into electoral reform after the 2024 election. I'm not too sure what the deadlines are for this committee, but I think they've got a certain amount of months after the 2024 election to report back to the minister. I think it's 12 or 24, something like that. So that's one thing that is, maybe the only good thing that's coming out of this legislation. But also that doesn't mean, even though there will be a task team looking at electoral reform, doesn't mean we are going to get electoral reform. And even if we do, we might get this kind of hodgepodge electoral reform that we have got now with this current act. And I'm still it's quite mind-boggling that the government has pushed through this legislation. Simply, it's a very confusing system, and as I say, it could lend to some distorted outcomes, which I think, while I don't think that's a big risk, I don't think it's something that we can completely discount.
Thank you very much for watching. A reminder, please, before you leave, to like this video if you have not yet done so. And we also invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us for all of our content, weekly content and analysis. Until next time, this has been Chris Hattingh, Head of Policy Analysis at the Center for Risk Analysis. Take care.